Welcome everybody to this end panel of a great conference. Congratulations to all the people who were giving papers. They looked just incredible in the program. I guess most of us are alumni of the World Bank, and some of us are actually here at the World Bank. And I just wanted to say, this is a place full of really smart people doing the hardest, directing themselves at the hardest challenges that humanity has to present. And you could say that's a product of cognitive bias, that when you worked here you had this, but actually the bias is even stronger once I'm on the outside looking in, once we're on the outside looking in. And among those hardest problems that humanity has is the one of how to deal with governments whose incentives for development aren't necessarily the same as ours. And this is an institution that's been grappling with this for a long time. Shekhar Shah sent an email reminding me of the 2004 WDR, the Politics of Service Delivery. And just last year, there was a big policy research report by Stuti Kamani on transparency and citizen engagement. And in between, there's just a lot of activity. But it's not, the institution I'm at now also has a strong track record in research on politics and development. But here, it's also an operational issue. So my whole time here at the bank there was one set of documents after another, commissioned by operational people with acronyms that I have long since forgotten, trying to delve into the institutional roots of development and the institutional challenges and the political economy challenges of growth, of education, of healthcare. So we're here today to figure out what we've learned in these many years, whether we should even be doing this at all, and what might be the next steps forward. So I thought, since this is former chief economists and current chief economacy people of the World Bank, these are economists, right? So the natural question to ask is, what is all this fuss about? Is the politics of development a distraction from worrying about policies, cognitive biases of poor people, human capital, education? Is it a distraction, or are we really convinced, as an intellectual matter, as a factual matter, that the politics of development is really an important determinant of development? And that's the question I'll just throw out. There's microphones. Yeah.
Well, it's my understanding that we were going to be talking what we have learned so far, and presumably from that figure out what we don't know already, which we already probably know we don't know. But in any event, as I thought about it, I was at the World Bank, 30 or some years ago, so I'm the oldest one here, we both senses, I suppose. I thought there were three big lessons of things that we now know a fair bit about that 30 years ago we did not. And I think it's worth, I don't think we know all about any of them, but I think we know a lot more than we did. The first one I think is the easiest, but the one that seems to have been learned least. And that is that in countries, especially where economic policies are, shall we say, very unfortunate, it is likely that there will become some kind of a crisis. Politically, a crisis is a time where somebody does get a lot more latitude than they normally have. Some of the political scientists call it suspension as usual. And when that happens, there is an opportunity. The real question is who seizes it. And in some countries, they've been fortunate enough to have a group or groups who have indeed thought about this, who have laid out a plan, and where there have been what I think of almost as blueprints that they could pull up quickly when a new leader came to power, did not know what to do, and had reasonably decent advisors around him. Excuse me. There have also been countries where indeed the opposite has been the case, namely some nut has decided that he knows how to turn sand into gold or something like that, and if only he had the tools he could use it, and that has happened too. And I think it's important to encourage the saner kinds of reform masters to have plans ready on the shelf to go, not because they will be adopted immediately necessarily, but because when the time comes, they will. And that has happened in more than one case that I know of, where people did hear the plea for the reform agenda and get with it. One of the packages that's important, or one of the things that's important in getting a package of reforms together, is I think to make sure, and one of the reasons it's possible to do it then, is because A, it is evident there's a crisis, and B, you can find a package normally that everybody's going to share in. It isn't going to be, oh, that group gains and this group loses. It's very likely to be one where there's going to be pain all around, the rich, the poor, the in-between. And while you can buffer the poor to some extent, You don't want to do it too much because then the program doesn't work. And besides, then the rich think they're not getting their share. And finding that balance is clearly important. How you do it, I think, depends on the country and the ethos and all that, but is part of it. Another important lesson, I think, is don't overpromise. And time after time, the overpromising, when reforms have been instituted, has sort of led to skepticism more than would otherwise have happened, especially when it takes a year or more for reforms to really take hold. A lot of people promise that within a year you will see this, you will see that, you will see the other thing, which is just grist for the opposition. And moving fast is important, but moving in a way that is predictable is also important. While I think it's important to announce the whole program, it's also, I think, important that it be time-phased so that there's not an expectation that, okay, we suffer this for 3 months, and then lo and behold, nobody will have to work anymore. It doesn't work that way anywhere, and that's important. So that would be the first thing I think we know a lot more now than we did. If I had more time, I'd talk about a couple of efforts while I was at the World Bank way back when, which look, in retrospect, kind of interesting, but for which I learned a lot. But anyway, I'll go on to the second one, and I think this is not as well learned even now, and that is how important the bureaucracy is. The bureaucracy, I think of as, we talk about the fourth estate, I think the bureaucracy is the fifth estate, if not the first. It simply has powers of all kinds that can impede or support whatever is going on in ways that can either help and facilitate or derail a program very, very fast, no matter what it is you're trying to do. You can pass a lot of laws that never get implemented. That's been known to happen in more than one case. Or you can pass a lot of laws that in their implementation are so subterfuged that in fact by the time it's done they have the opposite intention or the opposite result of what was intended. And recognizing the power of the bureaucracy and finding ways to get the bureaucrats to work with whatever the reform effort is, it seems to be is a very important component of it, and one that has all too frequently been either neglected or underplayed relative to its very importance. Bureaucracy can be a very powerful opposition everywhere. I had a graduate student once who went to work for a department in the U.S. government. I will not say which for reasons that will be obvious in a moment. And he came and saw him about 6 months later. The first month he'd been there, he'd been mostly learning the ropes. And the ropes consisted, among other things, of what to do when you get a new secretary for the department. And the point was how to tell the secretary nicely, by asking him questions, what he didn't know, and why, therefore, he would have to depend on the folks beneath him. And these questions could be very specific. What shall we do about thus and so, which is coming in from Seattle, to more general ones, but it was certainly things that they probably didn't even know in the bureaucracy, but by the time the poor secretary had heard all about it and found he couldn't answer these questions, he was pretty much in their hands, and it's a tried and true technique, and it's not only in this country, it's many others, where the same kinds of things happen. I've seen it happen in France as well, just to mention one close by, where the bureaucracy has a lot of its power because it knows how to handle and how to prove to the ministers that they do not know as much as the bureaucrats do. And it's, I think, important to get a hold of that. At one point I was working in Brazil for the U.S. aid way back when, and the Brazilian authorities had announced in 1964 that they'd had very high tariffs on everything. And the U.S. government had been urging trade liberalization, not this government, that government, way back when. And with the trade liberalization, the Brazilians happily announced that they had cut all tariffs in half. And there was a law duly passed to that effect. And my job a year later was to find out why nothing had happened. And I poked and I poked, and I went out to talk to firms and asked them, what are they doing? Nothing different than they were doing. Are you planning on exporting anymore? No, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, I took a gentleman from the Ministry of Trade out for a drink after work. And we began talking, and we talked for a while. Then finally, I told him my dilemma, what to do. That's very simple. Come with me. We went back to the ministry, and we went to the tariff schedule. And at the beginning of the law, there was a footnote. At the discretion of the government, any tariff may be reversed to its full former level. And no tariff had been changed. But they'd all been cut in half, and then one by one, they'd been raised as needed back to, they could be cut up to 50%, and they could be doubled back to their initial level. So basically, the bureaucracy had just taken over. Nothing had happened. And I've seen that happen time and time again. So I basically think that, I think of another case, there was a wonderful book, if you haven't seen it, in India, Arun Shuri, who was Minister of Disinvestment in India when they were, I think, genuinely trying to privatize, and his book is called Governance. It has a wonderful cover. It's worth seeing if only for that, because the picture is of a clerk standing in an office, books laid at the top of every bookshelf and so on, falling onto the floor, on the desk, papers everywhere. The clerk trying to hold some falling books from falling down. It's a lovely picture, but the book itself is equally good. And he starts by telling about how he was going to try and privatize some hotels, which should never have been in government hands in the first place. Oh, sorry. Did I turn it up?
No, it's too far.
Okay. He started with a chapter on how he tried to privatize hotels. The problem was the land registry was not sorted out, so the government of India could not even prove that it owned the hotels. So how could there be disinvestment? And over again, these kinds of things happen where one way or another, only a very clever group of bureaucrats who have connections in other ministries and so on can possibly break through any of this, because it is complicated and so on. And that brings me to my third and last point, and that is simply, we hear a lot about the law of unintended consequences. I think the first law of unintended consequences ought to be that there will always be unintended consequences. They're always there. And I think they make a strong case for anticipating what the incentives will be to duck around the regulations or the laws or whatever the reforms are. There have been too many cases when things that look wonderful on paper simply don't work. I heard and again, I'm using India not because it's any worse than anybody else, but I just happen to know it a little better and been working on it recently. But recently there was a report that NREGA, which is the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, NREGA, the government had commissioned a survey. And the survey was to find out how much of the incomes that were supposed to go to the employees actually went there. There was one state in which the answer was 0. Not one rupee had gotten through. There were another big state, 16%. The highest state was 50%. More than half of what was allocated for wages for these people who needed rural employment and presumably passed the test had obviously gone to the people who hired them and to others along the way, and very little had happened, or very little had happened relative to the amount spent. And I think that part was never taken into account as the act was passed. It was certainly well-intentioned, and it certainly has helped some people, but at much higher cost than might have been had it been otherwise. And one could go on, teachers not being in schools, et cetera, where indeed the problem is that the incentives aren't there for that, and the incentives are to find another way to do it. So let me stop there, because I'm sure the others have more current things to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Ann. So it sounds like Ann's take is, yes, politics matters, and the job of economists, for example, is to design public policies that are ready for when crisis happens, to disrupt the political equilibrium, and also always to be attentive to the implementation issues that are present in bureaucracies. I mean, in a nutshell. Go ahead, Francois.
Okay. Let me go back in time. At the time I was leaving the bank several years ago, I remember that in the talk I gave at that time, I said that when I came to the bank, I saw that development was essentially an issue in economics. And when I left the bank, I was completely convinced that it was purely politics. And since then, I guess that I simply reinforce this view that politics are extremely important. And you see politics really everywhere. You see it in the objective that a government may have. I remember to have talked to governments and to have realized about poverty reduction, and to have realized a little later that they were not at all interested by poverty reduction. They were interested by many other things, but not specifically by poverty reduction. For me, it was completely obvious that any government should have poverty reduction as a priority. You find politics in practically all decisions. I mean, when as economists we say there is some inefficiency in that country, and if we could make that kind of reform, then we would be progressing toward more efficiency. This is in generally fine, but in general this means that there will be losers and winners. And the point is that overall, there will be an aggregate gain, but we don't know how to redistribute from the winners to the losers. And because of that, this means that the decision will be highly political because it will be one group of people versus another group of people. And this is something that we find absolutely all the time. And it is not an issue of the redistribution mechanism are not there. You could have taxes or transfers. The point that when the loss and the gains are between two groups in the elite of economic elite of the country, then it is almost impossible to get the right kind of compensation. Another very common issue that we find is when we know that some reform will be Pareto improving, but some people will have a loss today, but will have a gain tomorrow. And then everything is about what is the discount rate that those people are using. And because of that, you may be in a situation where this kind of reform will not be accepted simply because the rate of the discount rate of some people is simply too high. And all the time we find that this kind of situation. So it is true that there are, as Phil said, fundamental restrictions, constraints on development, which may be human capital, which may be many different things, and progress can be made on all those fronts, but it will never be possible to eliminate completely the political issues. Then the problem is, okay, under this condition, what can we do as economists and probably, possibly as world bankers, because we cannot intervene in the political process. And then on this, I will join what Anne just said. I think that what we can do is to make sure that we have the analysis of what would be the effect of a reform meant to improve the efficiency of the economy, what its effects would be on various groups in the population, to make sure that winners and losers will be well identified, that all the elements, all the measures to be taken in order to implement that reform will be very, very clear, and to have that on the table, publicly exposed, so that, as Anne said, when a crisis comes, when the structure of political power is changing, so that suddenly the government has more power than it was the case before, then this kind of reform can be implemented. In other words, it means to have a kind of list of reforms which are completely well analyzed and maybe reanalyzed depending on the changes in the context. But I believe that this is really the way in which we can be useful in advising countries, not directly, not being able to push reform or to obtain that some reform will be passed, but making sure that the information is there and it is ubiquitous. I mean, everybody will have that information. And there is a second element, I believe, where we made a huge progress, and maybe we should continue, or we should reinforce this kind of progress. It is the field of evaluation. And because we are able now in a better way than it was the case before, and I'm not referring only to the RCT kind of evaluation, I'm referring to evaluation in general. I mean, the point that we are more able, I think, today than it was the case before to evaluate what has been the impact of some reform, of some policy. We are more able than it was the case before to measure social progress and to make that public. And this is a huge change, because this is, again, making the information set of all the actors in the country, in the political scene, aware of what has been the result of a policy, what is the kind of progress being made, whether it is too slow, whether it is at the right pace. And this is something which can still be reinforced. Not enough of it is taking place, but this is probably a direction in which we can very effectively affect the policy making process in the country that we would like to help.
Great, thanks, Francois. So again, politics matters a lot, and the job of economists, even World Bank staff, is to present the best policy advice, but be clear about the distributional implications, to reassure policymakers. This is just one part of what you said. Reassure policymakers about that the distributional implications may not be as grave as they think they are, or take advantage of politicians who don't care, and then give them that advice. Kaushik, what do you think?
Phil, thank you very much. Before I get into the topic, I should just say this is, after I left the bank in 2016, this is the first time I'm back, and really just feels so wonderful. And a bank is not a place where you feel sentimental, but walking in this morning to the 4th floor, I really felt sentimental. And people were also extremely loving to me, much more than they used to be when I was here working. I have to also check up what happened between when I left and now as to why they are more loving. Yeah. But thank you very much. Let me plunge right in. I'm virtually echoing what Anne and Francois just said. You know, the different perspective on economic policy, when you get into the world of policy making, to me came as a jolt, is one of the things you realize when you go in is we economists tend to be a bit supercilious when you go into the policy world, talking to the top bureaucrats, the top ministers, we know and you don't kind of attitude. But from my experience, since I went right from academe into first Indian policy making, then through the World Bank globally, you realize that's getting it wrong, that they don't understand, they don't have the capacity to understand, and you have to sort of pontificate to them, is completely wrong. In India, I had specific experiences, but not just India. Sub-Saharan Africa, sitting with finance ministers, you realize that actually people at the top have a huge amount of intelligence and understanding. But the constraints are very, very different, and we don't appreciate that enough. A very clear experience of that was very early in my policy experience, trying to decontrol petrol price in India. In those days, with international petrol price at $120, $130 per barrel, India would subsidize it massively, have a controlled low price for petrol, with people guzzling petrol as if it's a very, very cheap commodity, whereas the government was paying for it, there was a trade deficit, there was a fiscal burden, and there was environmental damage. I remember once, very early in a meeting, Montek Singh Ahluwalia and me explaining to the finance minister and top bureaucrats who are not economists about the economics of pricing and allowing the price to move up and down. After that, from the little summaries that these people were giving, you realize that they understand this very well. And the finance minister summed it up by saying that, look, actually, I understand exactly what you're saying, but my problem is as soon as I decontrol petrol price, there is going to be a truck strike in India from north to south, which is going to be paralyzing. You tell me, how do I handle that? And I'll do it. And actually, given that we did decontrol after some 6 months after that, a lot of it went into the how it is presented, what are the supporting policies you announce with that, to make something to remove a sort of political constraint for the policymakers, instead of just telling them that, look, this is what you need to do. That actually lived with me, and during my World Bank period also, this was coming out repeatedly. Let me point to a couple of areas where I do believe that this broadening of economics into politics, into psychology, something that we have been doing in the World Bank, is extremely important. And, you know, private players, the corporations, private sector, they are not through analysis, but through a sort of native intelligence, they are aware of that. So when they promote their own objectives, the corporate sector, they are using your psychology, they are using a sense of politics of the country. We don't do enough because maybe we are a bit more wedded to a book doctrine than just using practical sense. Let me try to pin down one or two things which I think we ought to pay attention to. This was a long problem in economics, but it has begun to change, that you treat the state as an entity. And so you will very often make a remark that, look, this is the responsibility of the state. We don't do that with the market. You don't say that this is the responsibility of the market that things are going wrong. You realize that the market is thousands of people with their own objectives, so even if the market is malfunctioning, you can't treat that as an entity that is making the decision. It's the outcome of hundreds and thousands of people. Something very similar is true in government. From the bureaucracy to the political leadership, they have their little objectives, agendas, and psychological also misunderstandings of facts and delusions, etc., which we as consumers also have. And you have to work through that and not treat this as a single entity that you are talking to. As a topic, let me just touch on one more thing, and I will, okay, that was not an action on your part. Then two more items I'm going to slip in. The first one is echoing a little bit again of what was just mentioned, that the design of programs is so important even if you have the same objective. India's food policy was a very, very good example to me. The Indian government has a policy of giving subsidized food to the poorest sections of the population. Supporting the poorest section of the population, I think, is a must. And it's the responsibility of the state, and the state has to do it. But the design is so very critical. And here I have to say, yes, bringing in a little bit of economics incentives is very, very important. In India, we know that the method was you have the state involved at every stage. The food is procured from the market. The government then sends it over to the 500,000 shops all over the country. Then government-run shops try to give this out to poor people below the market price. What you would expect with a little bit of rationality on the part of those shops is there's going to be leakage. And the leakage in India, we know, is 40 to 45% of the food collected for the poor does not reach the poor. It's a bit like the kind of figure that Anne was giving a short while ago. What do? People are so dichotomous in their thinking. As soon as you attack this method of distribution, there's a presumption also in society that you're trying to put an end to any form of support to the poor. It takes a lot of effort to say that I don't belong to that group that wants to put an end to that. But I think the mechanism you have to work on very, very carefully. There's no reason also why you have to involve the state at every stage. The state has to play a role. For instance, giving direct benefit to the people and then allowing them to buy it at market price would do a world of difference to the efficiency of the system. And you would probably get the same amount of delivery with much less of a fiscal strain coming in. Finally, to the large question I want to talk about, which I think in today's world is extremely important. It is a very fractious, troubled world. I don't know whether we always feel that way, but it can't be. I mean, I'm trying to think of my last 30 years, 35 years of active involvement in economics. It is a polarized world. Across the landscape, it's happening. Where is it coming from? What do we do? I think a lot of it is to do with technology. But here, again, you have to be very innovative in terms of thinking of the involvement of the state. And my mind, when I look at today's world, with new technologies, digital technology changing the landscape, artificial intelligence, is this an advantage which we will be able to reap? My view is this is certainly going to expand the cake, the total GDP. But it needs very, very novel regulation. The old style thinking should be thrown out of the window of state versus market. How much state, how much market is a completely sterile, pointless debate. Where you need the state, where you need the market, these things can change depending on how technology is changing. And we need innovative thinking over here to be able to capitalize on the innovations and technological advance that is taking place to have not just a bigger GDP, which we will have anyway, but a better distributed welfare, which we need not have, which will lead to more political turmoil. One historical example to illustrate this. The Industrial Revolution, 1860 to, let's say, 1940, 1950, was a time of dramatic changes, advances in technology. People say that we rode through that and we've come out very well. What people forget is we rode through that, but with a huge amount of radical thinking, which today does not appear to us radical, but actually it was radical thinking. It is also the period of Adam Smith, David Ricardo. New thought is being churned to take account of a changing economy. And there is some kind of a compulsion today, I feel, for the Adam Smith type moment to think in a new way about what's going on in the world, how to take on the challenge. And sticking to the historical example, things that were being brought in, the Factories Act, which we today take as sort of commonplace, that kind of regulation you do need, was that time a very, very novel thinking. And it was Robert Peel and others who were bringing in these ideas, and the regulatory framework was changed, and Industrial Revolution became an advantage. One small change which gets very little attention, Robert Peel pointing out, instead of taxing so many goods and so many points, why not have a system of income tax and lower this, stopping at the transactional point taxation? And in 1842, Britain brings in its first income tax, which today is commonplace. There's nothing novel about that. But it was novel thinking that time that you try to cut down transactions cost, but you do need revenue for the government, bring in something new, which is called the income tax, the 1842 Income Tax Act in Britain. I feel we are at a moment where we need to think of this interface between state, nature of state intervention, nature of regulation, and the changing landscape of the economy. And for that, the multidisciplinarity of economics, which we may not like because that is not our strength, but that is an absolute must. So it's a very, very good topic that we are discussing. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks a lot, Kaushik, especially for the historical viewpoint. So one observation I just wanted to make before handing off to Shanta is we've talked a lot, I think, about the politics of policy reform. So there's this discrete, chunky policies that are totally distortionary and problematic. But if we think about the problems of development, they extend to things that don't tend to have crises. They just have slow, steady decay, whether it's education, healthcare, the rule of law, the security of property rights, infrastructure. And there as well, probably, I think, politics is playing a role. And yet none of those things falls into a crisis, a moment of crisis. The distributional analysis of those policies is different than we would think of for tariffs or income redistribution policies. So I wonder what more we can do or think about in the context of these other hugely important determinants of development. Go ahead, Shanta.
Well, thanks. That's actually a good lead-in for what I wanted to talk about, very much along the lines of that's already been said. I'm going to ask two sets of questions. What have economists learned, and what has the World Bank learned, and what is the relationship between the two? If any. So, you know, if you go back to when development started, say, after World War II, the idea was that it was a question of capital constraints. You know, people, they needed infrastructure, they needed public goods. Generally, the problem of development was seen as a problem of market failure. And so you had interventions that tried to correct the market failure, like externally financed investments, and also provided technical assistance on how to build a bridge. Not only are you financing the bridge, but you're trying to build the bridge. And that was the basis of development interventions through the 1950s and early 60s. And you can see how this was a salubrious situation, because the governments could take credit for having solved a market failure, because that's what governments are supposed to do. And donors could take credit for having helped the government by financing that correction of the market failure, the building the bridge or the road, and also providing technical assistance. So everybody was happy. The only problem was it wasn't working. And we knew that it wasn't working, or we learned that it wasn't working, because in many of these countries, the policy framework was distorted. So you were building a factory, say, for exports, in a country with a highly overvalued exchange rate. So those exports were never going to be competitive, even though we provided the financing, we provided the technical assistance to build the factory. So then people started focusing on policy distortions and policy reforms that Anne mentioned just a while ago. And now the trouble with policy reforms was that it was a little bit more difficult, or the salubrious situation was interrupted, because often the policies themselves were the handiwork of the very government that you're trying to convince to remove the policies. And that's when the problem steps in. And you know, reams have been written about that, including by people on this podium. But I think, you know, the bank, again, took a while to realize that, because the bank's approach, and other institutions, I would say, was, oh, if the policies are distorted, why don't we just tell them to get rid of the policies or get them to reform it? And, hey, we will hold up our money. We will use conditionality to try to get them to reform it. But if you think about it, if those distortions were there for a reason, somebody was benefiting from the petroleum subsidies in India or the protected tariffs in Tanzania, then even the fact that you're actually holding up a loan, if they don't remove the subsidies or remove the tariffs, is not enough. Because politically, the person in charge might actually stand to lose the next election if they were to remove the subsidies, because of the truckers going on strike and so on. So the fact that they have to give up on a loan is hardly compelling a reason. As one policymaker once said to me, you know, if you have the choice between a $200 million loan from the World Bank and winning the next election, you know, which would you choose, Shanta? You know, right? And so we actually were caught in this conundrum. Now, some of the egregious policy distortions, like the overvalued exchange rate, were the subject of these conditionalities. But I think we lost track or lost sight of something else, which is these political distortions, politically motivated distortions, also existed in the individual sectors. Things like health and education and infrastructure, as Phil was suggesting. I mean, if you take a look at transport in Africa, I mean, everybody says that transport's very costly in Africa, and if you've driven on some of those roads, you kind of know what I'm talking about. But it turns out that most of the reason for those high transport prices in Africa is not the cost of the roads. It's the profit margins accruing to the trucking companies, because they have monopolies that are actually in the books. There are regulations in the books that say you can't, you can only have one trucking company. Now, the added consequence, the added problem, is that that trucking company is owned by the president's brother in many countries. Actually, in one country, it's owned by the widow of the founding father of the nation. So there's no hope for trucking deregulation in that country, right? And yet, we continue to build roads. That's because that's what we do, right? And so we build nicer roads, wider roads. All we're doing is increasing the profits of that trucking company. And road prices, transport prices are not coming down. It's the same thing with education. As we learned from the World Development Report of this year, there's a learning crisis. And, you know, it's very interesting. You have almost 100% primary school enrollment, and yet 80% of the children in rural India, 80% of the second graders in rural India could not read a single word in a paragraph. That's a crisis. If you keep in mind that these kids are going to school every day. Well, it also turns out that 25% of the time in India, the teacher is not there. The teachers are absent. And then you say, well, how is it that the teachers continue to be absent? Well, it's also the case that in India, the teachers often run the elections of the local politician. So the politician gets elected, turns around and gives the teacher a job for which he doesn't have to show up. And there you have it. You know, the teacher and the politician are in a nice, cozy equilibrium. The students are the ones who lose out. So this is a profound problem, particularly for an institution like the World Bank, because the main instruments we use, one of which is the investment project, the traditional investment project, might not only will not help solve the problem, but might actually be exacerbating it. We might be building wider roads to make the profits even larger and make it even more difficult to get any trucking deregulation in Cameroon or wherever. At the same time, our policy advice, and the kind of advice that all these people have been talking about, the analysis that we do, are typically then given to the government. And we usually, we do an analysis of the costs of fuel subsidies and the winners and the losers that Francois was talking about, and the incidence of these subsidies and the fiscal costs. And then we write a nice 100-page report and give it to the government and say, well, what do you think of it? Well, obviously, if the government is the one who has an interest in keeping those subsidies, you know what they think of it. Even if the government is somebody who wants to reform, and there have been many people who are genuinely pro-reform, it's not that useful to tell them the cost of the subsidy. They already know that. As Montek Singh Ahluwalia said to me once, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't think I can quote him directly, don't give me another 300-page report to tell me that trade liberalization is good. I already know that. So what should you do? Well, I think we have to do two things, and these are difficult things, but that's where we would be going forward. One is actually take this analysis that we've done, and this is very good analysis. People in this room are doing it every day, but make sure that it gets to the public, not necessarily just to the government. Because even if the government has no interest in reforming the subsidies, there are people, if these are subsidies that are truly costing, having a deadweight loss and are regressive, then there are people out there, the public, who actually stand to gain from it. And if you can use it to get to the public, and when I mean the public, I mean genuinely the public, the village women, get it in a form where they can actually absorb it, then that information might empower them to bring about the reform and to increase the chances of a political consensus. The second, and I'll just end there, the second is that this idea of a project where you bundle the knowledge assistance with the finance, which, as I said, goes back to the 1950s, when we thought that the problem we were solving was a market failure, for where it made perfect sense to bundle the two, actually doesn't make sense if the problem you're trying to solve is a government failure. Because, as I said, the knowledge, the technical assistance needs to go to the general public so they can bring about some change in the reforms. But the finance always has to go to the government because they're the only ones who can pay us back. So this very notion of bundling our knowledge assistance and our financial assistance, which is almost like a mantra in the World Bank. I mean, people often say that that's what makes the bank distinctive, actually is working against us. And I think the way we can bring about change is to actually separate the two. Provide the knowledge assistance to the general public and provide the finance to the government, but make sure that finance is financing things that general public wants to happen, rather than what special interests within the government want to happen.
Shanta, thanks a lot. Okay, so you may not be aware, but this is a tremendous cleavage that has developed on this panel, because we have three people who said the job of the World Bank, of economists, is to prepare the right advice and wait for the appropriate window of opportunity to present the advice. And maybe shape the advice to exploit the window of opportunity, but sort of let the window of opportunity come to the advice. Shanta is suggesting something different. We want to create the window of opportunity. To put it in a different way, there's the practices of multilateral development agencies, since forever, for many reasons, which is to serve governments and to serve the political equilibria that exist in countries. But those political equilibria tend to be antithetical to development for all the reasons that Shanta was talking about. The way people get elected is not by developing a country. The way people get elected is something else in many of the countries we work at. So Shanta is suggesting, no, we need to actually shift that so people are electing politicians for their progress on development, in achieving development, and not for other reasons. So I guess I can see what you want to think about that. And this is a tough one, so we can go left or right again, but you don't have to. But I also want to say this is not a suggestion being pulled out of a hat, the idea of shifting political equilibria. So if you were looking at the literature, there's one branch of literature would suggest, wow, to shift the political equilibria, this means manning the barricades and giving guns to poor people. So there would be some literature out there about elites versus non-elites, and this is clearly beyond our purview. But there's a whole other literature which talks about the significant effects of micro-interventions to inform voters about different stuff. And those micro-interventions seem to have significant effects on at least local political equilibria and lead people to demand more and get more from at least the local government officials they deal with. So there's hope for, okay, I should put my cards back close to my chest again. I'll let you guys talk. But there does seem to be room for MDA-friendly reforms that shift political equilibria, short of arming guerrillas. Go ahead, Anne.
Thank you. I think that one might wish to distinguish a bit between what I'll call economy-wide macro reforms and the micro reforms, and it's almost the difference between the bank and the fund. In the fund, when a country gets into trouble, the normal thing for sure is the fiscal, the monetary, the exchange rate. And those things are central. And you can't quite do it piecemeal, at least not when you get close to the point where it really needs to work. On the other hand, in the bank, there's both an advantage and a disadvantage. There may be a prime minister and maybe even a parliament who isn't very interested, but if the minister of agriculture can get a program that gets something done, he may want to do it even if the whole government isn't with it. So I would think I would agree to some extent on the micro possibilities. I'd be more skeptical on the macro, where I think it does need to take more of an overview approach. So I think it may be a distinction I should have made.
I'm not sure that there was really such a scission between Shanta and the rest of us. I mean, I have the feeling that, as far as I'm concerned, I completely agree with what Shanta said. I mean, the point is that we should not prepare blueprints for reforms and keep them somewhere to propose to them when there is a shift in the political equilibrium. We should make sure that those blueprints or that those reflections are completely public. And then this is bringing or leading us to another issue, which is the issue of the way in which information must be disseminated. Because within the country you have media which will be disseminating the information, and we know very well that those media may be manipulated. They may belong to some part of the political network, and because of that it is not clear that the truth or the rigorous evaluation of a reform will be conveyed to the public, because it might be modified by the media. So from that point of view, I think that the bank and other organizations, NGOs at the international level, which can do the kind of analysis I was referring to before, or the kind of evaluation of the way in which some public services are working, evaluation of the cognitive achievement of people getting out of schools. All this must be part of the way in which we can modify the opinion of the people. So to make sure that we have this kind of independent and neutral, non-unbiased sources of information about what is really going on, what is social progress that has been achieved, what could be the impact of this kind of reform, is something which is absolutely essential. Now, in some countries, advice or reports coming from the World Bank may be completely considered as pure propaganda by the neoliberal part of the world. But this may not be the case if there are other organizations which are doing the same kind of job. I mean, organizations like Oxfam and these kind of people can do, as a matter of fact, in some cases, this kind of evaluation. So to make sure that there is a vibrant circle of thinkers or economists and political scientists who analyze these issues from outside, I think is something which is essential.
Kaushik, go ahead. Thanks. Sorry for misinterpreting you, Francois. That's good.
I just thought I'll elaborate on this a little bit. You know, the political equilibrium is turning vile in many ways, but we don't quite know what to do about it. So what should be the response of economists? One of the reasons, by the way, the political equilibrium is turning vile is our increased knowledge means politicians know how they behave, what they do, what it does to the voter response. The more you know, in the olden days, after you've won an election, for the next 2 years, you would turn to some useful work for the country because you know that after that, you'll again hot up for the next election. Now, from the day you win this election, you begin to work for the next election because you know that everything that you're doing is having some impact on the voters' preference for you and your party. And it's such a big winner-take-all game, politics today, that it is becoming sort of all-absorbing game. What do you do over there? And I do believe that in the end, it is the voters' knowledge, information, ideas, how they think, plays a critical role. How misinformation can be done in so many ways. It's almost impossible to regulate. I mean, you don't even have to misinform. How you show a particular political leader's photographs, which kinds you display on your newspapers, you can begin to influence people's opinions on that person. You don't have to utter a comment. Hundreds of ways of doing that. Here, just the ordinary people's thinking and clarity plays a strikingly important role. And really, I feel for an organization like the bank, and we do that very, very well in terms of trying to reach out, but we need to improve on that vastly. Making the information available, talking to people, as Francois said, there is always a little bit of suspicion that is it a few countries, powerful countries' opinion that is being given out. But you know, if the analysis is good, if it is data-based, if it is analytical, where you are really making very few ideological points over there, just presenting this, I feel it's extremely important. And again, in the policy world, when I was involved actively, this would come up time and again, that it is not a question of persuading these politicians. It's a question of persuading the ordinary people so that the politicians would find it in their interest to do it because ordinary people are persuaded. Indeed, I'm glad that we are emphasizing that.
Great, Kaushik. Thanks. I guess I want to point out there's research out there that show we're talking about some pretty sophisticated information trickling down to voters or actually being placed right in front of them. But there's a lot of evidence that suggests voters are fundamentally ignorant of things like what should government be doing for me. So we have work in the Philippines, which talks about a huge municipal spending program. So every Philippine city or town finances all of its infrastructure out of a very large fund that the central government gives. And it turns out most Filipino voters didn't really know about it in the areas we surveyed. And as a consequence, the governments didn't spend the money because they didn't need to, because nobody knew about it. So it's nothing sophisticated about the analysis. So then you would think, so this is a big prelude because I want to challenge Shanta on, okay, exactly, what do we think we should do? Because then it turns out we provide this information and then we did a little cost-benefit analysis based on the data we got. And it turns out from the point of view of competing mayoral candidates, it's way better in terms of cost effectiveness to buy votes than to distribute flyers telling voters what their promises are with regards to this spending program. So the voters absolutely care about the promises, they absolutely care about the spending program, but it's not cost effective for mayoral candidates to give them that information. It's better to give them to buy votes for different reasons. So that sounds like a project. Okay, we're gonna have a big program to supply flyers. I mean, there's a loan. Go ahead.
No, fair enough. By the way, everything else I said I actually learned from some papers of Phil, so this is this is a useful discussion. No, let me first say a little bit about. There's probably a little bit more of a schism, maybe with something that Anne said and Francois as well, which is this other notion that when we find a Minister of Agriculture who's a reform champion, then maybe we want to support him or her. And I hear that all the time, and we tend to talk about it at the bank. I think even that is a little dangerous in this situation. Because first of all, you know, who are we to decide who is a reform champion and who's a reform opponent? But more fundamentally, what I find is that these people can be very good at pretending to be reform champions by speaking our language and behaving like we do, and then seducing us into thinking that that's what's going to happen. Let me give you one example from Zambia. You know, in 1991, you know, Kaunda had stepped down, so there was first-time multi-party elections. Chiluba was elected, and there was a minister of finance who, in the words of an IMF colleague, spoke our language. And the bank and the fund just loved him, you know. And we signed a whole bunch of structural adjustment operations with him. But when it came to implementation of the reform, and one of the critical reforms was maize price reform, which is always a controversial subject in Zambia. It turned out this minister had, not only had he not consulted with the public, he hadn't even consulted with his cabinet colleagues. And the maize price reform was the responsibility of the Ministry of Agriculture. So the Minister of Agriculture looked at this and said, well, I never signed up for this, and reversed the program, and the structural adjustment loan was canceled. Right? So we have to be very careful that we're too easily seduced by this, the person who speaks our language. Just make sure that that person is actually representing some kind of political consensus in the country, which is much more important than that person's own view. But I fully take Francois's point and what Phil was alluding to. This idea of informing the public is extremely imperfect. And can go wrong. I mean, it can go seriously wrong. It's not just, you know, not between flyers and vote buying, but, you know, can do serious damage. But I think that's why we need lots of people working on that. You need competition. You need a multiplicity of voices, but all of which are evidence-based. And that's where the evaluations come in. You know, when we have these pieces of evidence, we should make sure that we get that out there and let there be contestability. Let Oxfam come out with his own analysis, and then but make sure that the public is seeing that rather than getting a single view. And I think this is particularly important in low-income countries, mainly in Africa, where there aren't that many voices. I mean, in India, you've got everybody and his brother has an opinion on what they should do about petroleum price reform. But in Togo, it's just a few voices. And I think that again comes back to what we need to do, which is to build the domestic capacity to do this research, so that this kind of activity can be done in the country. And it makes a profound difference. You know, when you think about, yeah, I mean, I'll say something else controversial, but you know, the structural adjustment programs of the 1980s and 90s have been criticized, mostly on grounds that, well, people say these were the wrong policies and so on. Then you look at the 2000s in Africa, and you find that Africa enacted a whole series of policies and did very well. I mean, growth rates almost doubled. And they were the exact same policies as the ones in the structural adjustment programs. So why did they not work in the 70s and 80s, or the 80s and 90s, and why did they work in the 2000s? Well, there was a big difference. In the 80s, those programs were designed on 19th Street, on either side of 19th Street, here and at the IMF. In the 2000s, by that time, in many countries, those programs were designed by Africans in the country, by economists, people that we know. And that was what made the difference. Those were actually the policies that were owned by the public in the country. So the more we can do to develop that capacity, the more we can get this information out to the general public.
I'm thinking I launch another question, but maybe people want to line it, if people want to have, yeah. So I'm going to ask a question, and if people want to ask questions after this question, please line up at the microphones. So everybody thinks politics is important. There may be some different prescriptions about what to do about it, and now I want to pin you down about how important you really think it is. This is an institution that's had a flat budget for a long time, I guess, right? And so every single thing we've said about politics requires some operational person to spend time on the analysis of the political economy stuff, on negotiating with government to insert some politics stuff. Okay, question is now going to end. How much of the administrative budget of the World Bank, compared to now, should be dedicated to making development reforms more politically acceptable, or to changing the political equilibrium to make governments more receptive to development objectives? Should we be lowering the amount of lending so that more resources can be put into the loans we have? In my experience, political economy is like chapter 6 of any document, of a 6-chapter document, and usually not even that. So should it be chapter 3 or 2? These are what kind of trade-offs should we be making if politics really is a first-order impediment to development? Deafening silence.
Want answers or?
Oh, I was thinking, yeah. So,
I'll start.
Okay, yeah. Sorry,
Okay.
I didn't know people would be so enthusiastic. Okay, so.
No, I would say that you're asking the wrong question, which is how much of the budget should be allocated. I think the question is, what's the outcome you want to achieve, right? And then you figure out how to get there. Right? So if the outcome is you want to get energy to poor people, energy access to poor people in Malawi, then the budget should be allocated to that if you value that. And then you use whatever instruments you have to get that energy access to poor people. Now, it turns out that the answer to that is probably not build another power plant, because Malawi is subsidizing energy to all sorts of exorbitant attempts. And then you have to step back and say, well, what can we do about those energy subsidies so that we can actually have efficient power plants that actually get access, and then work back from there to say, well, how do we get those subsidies reformed? And then you may have to invest in some political analysis on what it takes to bring about energy subsidy reform. But I don't want to make that decision ex ante. I think just focus on the outcome, and then let the teams decide how to allocate resources.
If you guys have a burning desire, then go ahead. Sorry, guys. We won't leave till you ask.
I think it depends very much on the country and the issue. I don't think there is any general prescription that makes any sense. Sometimes there are things that are so important that until they're done, not much else will make any sense. Other times there are things that you can do that can pave the way, and I don't think that's one way you could say either or you could say how much, and of course I don't know how much the World Bank is doing now, so I can't comment on that anyway.
Yeah, what I wanted to say, I find that your suggestion is a bit dangerous. Because there must be a kind of limit between the technical advice and interfering to some extent with the political game in the countries. And so when you are telling a government, okay, you should do this kind of reform, and this is the way you can make it politically acceptable, I would not feel really very well personally, even when I was in the bank, doing this kind of thing. If we are able to convince a government that this reform is really quite important and they should really do all what they can to implement it, it is their job to find the way in which they will make it politically acceptable. It is their job to find the kind of deals that they have to make with big business there or the unions over there in order to make sure that the reform will pass. But this is something that we see every day in all countries, and this is really what politics is about. So I don't think that we should really get into from economic expertise into political expertise.
And chipping in a similar vein, I feel the political sensitivity is something which ought to permeate through a lot of the work. So it is not a question of a budgetary allocation which will do it. And a lot of these ideas are being generated in universities, in think tanks. And the aim here is to draw in on some of this and just let it mingle with decision making, which is economic decision making. And occasionally you'll feel a budgetary need on a specific instance which you do. So I don't think it's a prior budgetary shift is called for by this consideration, though I agree it's a very, very important consideration. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Sergio Martinez, and I'm going for 3IE Impact, International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. I actually have two quick questions, one for Shanta and one for Kaushik. For Shanta, following up your comment that you say that knowledge assistance should come to the public in regards to the government. So I'm wondering, how can the World Bank strengthen the citizen engagement mandate that was established in 2013 to enable more active transparency and accountability initiatives for citizens to engage with all the projects in that sense? And for Kaushik, I am intrigued for the book that you wrote in 2009 about how to be an economist in the real world. And I think it's very valuable for all of us that are engaged in this conversation right now, especially. So I'm wondering, how would you suggest that an economist put his feet on the ground to achieve the big commitments in development, such as the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals agenda, especially in reaching the multi-stakeholder partnerships that we need right now with private sector, civil society, and academia in a more dynamic way? Thank you.
Why don't I take one more from Raju? Raju, go ahead, yeah.
Thank you very much. Raju Singh, Program Leader for Haiti. So thank you for a very interesting panel discussion. I still have some opportunity to teach. And I'm teaching a course on political economy and explaining to students why bad policies are being implemented. And in this course, I mean, I have my little stakeholder exercise where I put the little players. And last time I was teaching, there was a kid raising his hand and say, yes, thank you very much for your nice diagram, but you, World Bank, where are you on this diagram? So when we jump in this political economy discussion, we always assume that we are the benevolent facilitator, the unbiased advisor. But are we? Are we just, or are we perceived by the other players as the benevolent facilitator? Or are we just another player in the game? Any thoughts? How should that change? How can we influence the other players? Thank you very much.
So there's three questions. One for Shanta, one for Kaushik.
Adil Malik, University of Oxford. Just to extend the previous question, and you mentioned bureaucracy and unintended consequences. We now have a lot of evidence that suggests that donor interventions sometimes undermine state capacity in developing countries. What does this imply for the debate we are having here? The second comment is that when we say we need to take politics seriously, in a sense we need to take our insufficient knowledge of politics also seriously. There are two aspects of politics which we know very little about. One is transition, because a lot of discussion about politics is about final outcome variables. We don't know how we move from one political order to another political order, and this was very evident from Daron's presentation yesterday. What we do know is that it has to be an incentive-compatible arrangement. But when we talk about incentive-compatible arrangements, we have to reinvent or reimagine our understanding of what rents are, because there are a lot of rents that are economically inefficient, but politically efficient. And I'm talking about those sorts of rent sharing, which involve unproductive rents, but you distribute them to buy spoilers to kind of make sure that they don't spoil the reforms. The other area in politics that we know very little about is informal institutions. It's a complete black box. And these informal institutions could be hugely important for donors to think about, because that's where, institutional reform can be more meaningful.
We'll just hold off. There's 3 sets of questions.
It's a little bit related to the last one, so maybe we can just bundle them together because it's a little bit the same. I mean, my comment was Annabelle Bear from the World Bank. I think, it's great to have this conversation in a large forum like this one. I think my comment is related to the previous one, that we need to understand a little bit better that process, right? The development process and that economic and political transitions that countries experience. So as they move towards a more rule-based, institution-based society with type of dynamics, we need to understand better what will make them move towards that path, and then what role the World Bank can play, because we know it's complex, it's not an either-or proposition, and maybe in the example from the truck company, the solution to that is not to have a revolution and getting every village woman, go and stand for their rights, but maybe it's just developing a new economic group that will demand political rights, and then will have a stronger influence on the policy-making process. And then maybe understanding better where those groups can come from, maybe agriculture, agribusiness or something, and at some point they will accumulate enough economic power to demand political power as well. And I think that has worked. History shows that has been more likely the path that countries have taken. And I think we have started having these discussions under the systematic country diagnostics, and I think we need to get more into that type of discussion so we can really influence the, country partnership framework or the areas where the World Bank is going to engage. Because sometimes the solution is not going into the difficult areas, but just bypassing, going around them to create a different type of environment where addressing that problem is not going to be that difficult politically.
I'm Elizabeth Isaac from IESC. My question is probably to Shanta because it's related to how we can ensure continuous positive impact from our development programming in countries like Sri Lanka, where with changing leadership, programs that are currently being implemented may not see it all through to its entirety because of changing priorities and changing interests, because new leadership obviously may not have the interests that the current leadership are having.
Great, thanks. Shanta, there's a couple questions for you, one for Kaushik, and then a general issue about how is the World Bank as a political actor in these countries? And then some comments that were very interesting, but they weren't necessarily questions. Thanks.
Shall I start? Yeah. Okay, thanks. Yeah, these are all great questions. Sergio asked about the citizen engagement initiative. Keep in mind, what I was talking about was getting information out to citizens in such a way that they can actually absorb it and make use of it. The Citizen Engagement Initiative at the World Bank, unfortunately, has become one of citizen engagement in our projects. So that's not always the information that we want people to get. In fact, sometimes it's the opposite, because we build a school, and the citizen engagement is to ask whether the school is being built well, or whether it's easy to get to, and so on. But the information I'd like to get out there to all the citizens is the absentee rate of teachers. Which sometimes our projects, don't want to reveal because that makes the project questionable in the first place. So I think these are going on in almost opposite directions. But I fully agree with you that we should turn it into something that actually benefits the citizens. Raju, I don't know whether that was intended to me, but where is the World Bank in the diagram? I guess since I'm the only one still at the World Bank on this panel, maybe I have to answer. I think we have to come clean. There are times when, with the best of intentions, and I like to think that we have good intentions, the World Bank has actually had counterproductive effects. And this is the law of unintended consequences that Anne was referring to earlier. I mean, just think about it. I know I was the chief economist of the region. I probably approved this too, where we built an electric power plant in Egypt at a time when energy subsidies were of the order of 6-7% of GDP. So think about if you have 7% of GDP in energy subsidies and you build yet another electric power plant, you just increase the distortion. And that actually was a welfare loss. So I think that's a perfectly good question. I liked Adil's point about donors undermining state capacity. Again, just because it reminded me of this episode. I was in Benin. You know, Benin is a small country. There are like 8 or 9 donors, and the government was describing to us how they conform to the financial management regulations on their budget for all the donor projects. You know, they say we have this process for the World Bank and this process for the French and this process for USAID and everything else. So I just asked an innocent question. I said, yeah, that describes what you do with the donor money. What kind of process do you have for your own resources, the rest of the budget? And they said, we have none, because all of our staff are fully occupied in trying to conform to the donors' restrictions, that we just don't have the capacity to manage our own resources. And that was 80% of the budget. That was their own resources. So we really have to keep in mind that every time we insist on conforming to certain regulations for our own money, we might be taking away state capacity from somewhere else.
The question that was directed to me, and then just a few comments. So Sergio, on that question, in fact, I have the least to say, because it's a compelling question. How do economists engage on the ground? That is, in some sense, what we are talking about. It is, you have to appreciate the political institutions, you have to appreciate the social institutions and informal norms that guide society, which someone else brought up. It's an awareness of that you have to take to the ground in order to be more effective. And at one level, my book that you referred to is a book where I talk about my transition from a completely academic life to this, where I had to develop some of that intuition in order to be able to engage. Turning to a couple of other things about we are the benevolent player to that question. You have to realize that the more correct statement is we should be the benevolent player. But we are not always so. We have our own interests. There is some particular stance that I take which may be good for me, but not that good for the country, but we may occasionally compromise. Here, all I will say, it sounds like a bit of a moral science lecture, that we have to just keep reminding ourselves that that is what we are supposed to do. And yes, you can be self-interested when you go into the market trying to buy goods, you maximize your utility. But when you are in the profession of giving advice, when you're talking to another country, you have to be really interested in their welfare. And being able to stick to that is welfare enhancing for yourself in a more enlightened, long-run fashion. And finally, to this thing about informal institutions, since you brought in rule-based society, someone else was mentioning moving towards that. These are important, and I have actually taken a lot of interest now in institutions because of my belief that even rule-based society, which looks very different from a society which runs on informal norms, at a fundamental level, it is very, very similar. And the norms in which we run our everyday society are critical for an outsider to understand. A lot of advice goes completely to waste if you don't appreciate some of the sentiments of the people to whom you are giving this advice. So again, the World Bank, and this is coming back to something we have been discussing, the World Bank ought to have greater sensitivity to this, and for the very same purpose of what the World Bank is trying to do, in order to be more effective where we want to be effective.
You're good?
Yeah, I mean, only a few comments on where the donors stand in this political equilibrium that was described by this gentleman. Several remarks have been made about this. I would like also to insist on the fact that the World Bank or donors may also be influential through ideas, I mean, through dogmas. I mean, we have to remember that. We have to remember that when we're talking about the structural adjustment programs, there was something of an ideology behind all this. We came back on this, but from that point of view, we can say that the intervention of the benevolent donor was not that neutral in terms of what was going on in those countries. So I think, I mean, fortunately, this is much less the case today, but I think that we should be really careful in making sure that we are really neutral. It was said that we don't know very much about the way in which those political equilibrium can change and how you move from one equilibrium to another. This is certainly the case. But I would like also to emphasize the fact that there are many things in this area where our knowledge is really very limited. When we talk, for example, about institutions and the way in which institutions are functioning or not functioning, when we talk about informal institutions and their relationship with formal institutions, and the fact that there may be, in many cases, some kind of a conflict between both, there are a lot of things that which we don't know. I happen to co-direct with my friend Jean-Philippe Plateau this big research program which is funded by DFID on economic development and institutions, and we are doing a lot of work, a lot of research, but it is really quite amazing to see that the state of knowledge is not really very advanced. So from that point of view, I think that we should be investing much more on trying to understand how these things work. This is, I think, something absolutely essential.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Ramesh Vaidya. I'm a former member of the Planning Commission of the Government of Nepal, and currently I'm associated with an intergovernmental organization, EC Mode, in Kathmandu. I have a question for Dr. Devarajan. Dr. Devarajan, this is in connection with the question of issue of multiplicity of voices and how you can develop the domestic capacity for research in developing countries. The way I see is, in most of these developing countries, the existing institutions probably don't do much research, evidence-based research. Universities are mostly for teaching purposes, and think tanks usually is a place where people go after they are retired. And so it's a different kind of a situation. So in those cases, how could we motivate young people? How can we bring back lots of, like people from Nepal who are in the US, young people to come back to Nepal and to do this kind of research? What kind of economic incentives can we give them? Now, what I've seen is most of the international organizations, when they need to work on some analysis, policy or otherwise, whether it is the World Bank or IFC or others, they often engage international consultants. Now, those international consultants may have a domestic partner, but that domestic partner is often a sleeping partner. So I think that is one area where these multinational organizations, multilateral banks and others have to look into. How can we give economic incentives to attract back young people from these countries who are so well trained all over the world to go back to their own countries and do this kind of analysis to give the multiplicity of voices you are talking about? Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Thanks for that question. That's a longer conversation, but let me just answer it by giving you an example of one relatively successful case, which is the African Economic Research Consortium in sub-Saharan Africa, which started about 30 years ago. But they deliberately said, we're not going to be part of an international organization. They got money from the Ford Foundation and some money from the World Bank and a few others, but it was an independent organization. And the most important thing they did, which is getting to your point about the universities, is that they financed research grants for individuals at universities all over Africa. And then every 6 months, a group of us used to travel, they still do, to Nairobi, and they bring all these researchers in and help them with their research proposals, help them develop it, and then publish the results. And this has been a phenomenal success. There must be a couple of thousand very well-trained African economists now on the continent, and a few of them have become governors of central banks and ministers of finance and things like that. So it's been a long process. But the important thing was, there were two things. One is the independence from the international organizations. Indeed, one of the explicit points was we were handing out these research grants so that these same people did not have to do consulting contracts for the World Bank in order to supplement their salaries. Because the consulting contracts in the World Bank weren't really building their research capacity. They were just collecting data or something like that. So this was actually to bribe them, to take them away from doing consulting contracts. But the second is the fact that we finance individuals and not institutions. And this was somewhat controversial, but at least the way African universities worked, and maybe it's the case in Nepal as well, if you said you were giving a grant to the Department of Economics at the University of Yaoundé, then the senior-most professor thinks that he should get the grant. But he's probably the one who's doing the least amount of research, or capable of doing new research. So we actually went in and financed individuals rather than institutions.
Great, Shanta. I think there's a two-part closure. I will close the panel. Shanta will close the conference. I just want to thank the panelists. I think we were as provocative and controversial as economists possibly can be, which may not be very, but I thought it was super stimulating. Thanks for really engaging with these issues.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for coming. This has been a great conference, but I also want to make sure I thank the people who made it happen. And we had a terrific team led by Claudia Sepulveda, sitting over here. I'll mention all of them, and then you can clap. Gabi Calderon, Rula Yasigi, Alejandra Ramon, Kelly Revanter, Anushka Tevaraperuma, Gittis, Jason, and Adam on the technology side. So please give them a round of applause.